Greetings everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on female Bhaktas and the poetry of protest. There had been a long line of women poets who mocked pedantry, rejected ascetic withdrawal and emphasized the intense and mystical experience of personal devotion. The 6th century Tamil women poet saint Ammayar initiated the women bhakti tradition, creating a space for women to venture into, and then there was no looking back. As one discusses the spatial spread of bhakti movement, the trend that started with Tamils in the 6th century was propounded in Karnataka by the Veer Shaivas during 12th century, then Varkaris and Mani Biharis in Maharashtra from 12th to 17th centuries. Later, in 14th, 15th and 16th century, the Bhakti movement spread to Rajasthan, Gujarat, Kashmir, Punjab as well as Bengal. Now, in this entire regional course of the Bhakti movement, the kind of poetry that was being developed by the female Bhaktas indicated some kind of a rebellion. The rebellion of women started with the poetic expression of their own lives and the kind of lives that they would like to lead. Their poetry thus transgressed from the inner to the external domain, from the courts and temples to open spaces of the field, the workplaces as well as the women's homes, kitchen, etc. So, they not only carved out a psychic space of refuge for themselves in course of composition of this poetry, but also they covertly constructed a scathing satire of the religious as well as social conventions, and all this is very well reflective in their compositions as has been discussed. Now, a very important change that had emerged from early medieval period onwards was the use of language of the masses. So, breaking the literary and the religious holds of Sanskrit, the women poets composed poetry in regional languages to address the people in languages they could understand. Their spirit of defiance was executed at multiple levels. As emerges in Meera's confession, friends, marriage of this world are false. They are wiped out of existence. Wed my indestructible one, the serpent death cannot devour. So clearly Meera confessed that whatever is happening in this world, it is false, and so she has moved beyond and she has transgressed the boundaries of this world. And if one talks about Meera's life and the decisions that she had taken, they definitely appear to be very path-breaking. And one such anti-patriarchal and path-breaking decision was her refusal to be a mother. She refused to continue the Rajputana lineage, and it was a major blow which she struck at the roots of patriarchy, because in the Rajput society, women were valued as mothers of sons and not as women in themselves. So it was really painful for the family to realize that here there was a daughter-in-law who was not interested in carrying on the family legacy. Then she was also against the social norms, as is visible in the following lines. I constantly rise up, go to God's temple and dance, snapping my fingers. I don't follow the norms. As an oldest daughter-in-law, I have thrown away the veil. So there was an open declarance of the kind of rebellion she was venturing into, and she refused to veil herself. Then Meera's unhappiness is also visible in some of the lines. O friend, cannot live without the delight giver. Mother-in-law fights, my sister-in-law teases, the Rana remains angry. They have a watchman sitting by the door and a lock fastened on it. Why should I give up my first love, my only love? Meera's God is the lifter of mountains. Oh, nothing else pleases me. So here again there is a clear-cut comparison between the kind of problems that the family is posing for her and how her heart is only for the first love, that was her Giridhar. Now there is some kind of open defiance that is visible in many of her compositions. For example, if Sisodia is angry, what will he do to me? I will sing the virtues of Govind, my friend. If Rana is angry, he will stay in his own country. If Hari is angry, I will wither, friend. I don't care for worldly position. So again, this kind of a constant comparison between the earthly husband and kind of challenging his authority and taking solace in the fact that there is always her divine partner who would be there taking care of her. Then another important female Bhakta, Bahina Bai. Bahina Bai wrote in her autobiography, I was now 11 years of age, but I had not had one moment of joy. Again she stated, I had no independence and my wishes had no effect. I was very depressed in spirits. My daily life was full of troubles. So the very fact that here there was a woman who was just writing about her feelings, she was just kind of reflecting on the emotions that she was going through, is a very important kind of a change that she was making to her own self. So she was talking about being a woman, that how she also had right to be happy. Bahina Bai comes across in her Abhangas as a rebellious and a bold person, and her refusal to abandon her bhakti and her search for truth. As goes in the following Abhang, the Vedas cry aloud, the Puranas shout, no good comes to woman. I was born with a woman's body. How am I to attain the truth? They are foolish, seductive and deceptive. Any connections with a woman is disastrous. Bahina says, if a woman's body is so harmful, how in this world will I reach the truth? So again, she was kind of challenging the notion that how could a woman be impure, or how could a woman be a reason behind all the problems, because after all the entire world, all the humans are born out of women only. Now so therefore we can say that bhakti was providing a space for these women to express themselves, and it also gave them a chance to move out of the restricted physical space of the house and move into the realm of the larger spiritual space. And in this process, they got the freedom and independence to pursue their own will. For all these women bhaktas, the rejection of the power of the male figure that they were tied to in subordinate relationships became the terrain for struggle, self-assertion, as well as some kind of alternative seeking. This gave lot of courage to the women to sing divine melodies from the heart, articulating their concerns and singing unhindered and unfettered in their own voices. Though many of the women saints in medieval India had emerged from an atmosphere of discrimination, many of them charted their own course, and in the end they emerged as strong individuals with a mind of their own, and all this was possible due to the space that they appropriated by being part of the bhakti movement. So the important theme that one comes across is their attempt at creating autonomous spaces. No one was giving them these spaces. They were themselves appropriating those spaces, and they sought to escape patriarchy as well as the demands of domesticity by creating this autonomous space for themselves, and also not being termed wayward loose by going on long pilgrimages to different holy places, because after all whatever they were doing was to be seen with reference to a religious outpouring and a spiritual yearning on their part, which was definitely considered as far more legitimate than just leaving their house and walking away. This also demonstrates the creative use of tradition as both an element of protest and also to carve out some personal space for themselves. We usually consider that religion is a very traditional kind of a thought process, and to be irreligious means to be modern. But here we have examples of how these female bhaktas, they kind of made use of a very creative use of this tradition of religion, and they were also protesting while they were also pursuing religious pursuits. Now, the sacred hymns was another creative use of tradition which was picked up, and how through these sacred hymns they not only created a respect for themselves in society, but also this creativity gave a vent to their pent up feelings. This imagery was adopted by the Bhakti saints and the women, whose songs became very popular to put forward their views and desires. In these songs of these female bhaktas, we see a reworking of the ritual and the musical traditions to respond creatively to the needs of the time. So therefore, there was a very interesting amalgamation of music as well as rhythm as well as lyrics, and so it was not as if it was plain writing or just plain vachanas. So in due course of time, the attempt was made to cast off all notions of decency and modesty. And this was the first and the foremost thing which many of these women did, was to cast off the notions of patriarchal decency. Akka Mahadevi shed her clothes and walked naked. Similarly, Lal Dad, as I had just discussed, did the same. Now, as was pointed out by Akka Mahadevi in some of her compositions, which indicate that she was beyond femininity. Brother, you have come, drawn by the beauty of these billowing breasts, this brimming youth. I am no woman, brother, no whore. Then another very interesting development that one can talk of are some other female bhaktas like Saint Janabai. In one of her compositions, which goes like this: let me not be sad because I am born a woman. In this world, many saints suffer in this way. Cast off all shame and sell yourself in the marketplace. Then alone you can hope to reach the Lord. So there was again an open defiance that why a woman should be limited to the domestic sphere. So a woman who wants to reach the Lord, who wants to achieve salvation, has to go out and she has to maybe stand there in the marketplace, and instead of remaining aloof in the family and only being in the domestic sphere is not only going to be harmful, but it is also going to restrict a woman's chance of meeting the Lord. Then several of these female bhaktas were also restless wanderers, as goes in as is conveyed in the following composition. Pain spreads through my body. My mind is intoxicated. I have found few friends. All of them are mad. The chakor loves the moon. the moth by the lamp is burnt. The fish dies without water. Dear, indeed is such love. How can I live without seeing him? My heart is not at rest, as was diverged by Meera. So, another interesting theme was that of rising above the body, that is, becoming unconscious about one's own physical self. Akka Mahadevi has now risen above the body and has no need for any jewels and clothes, which in her earlier life were a very important parameter of her status vis-a-vis her husband. So, this was the kind of feeling that was conveyed in their compositions. Then, as the other saying goes of Akka Mahadevi, you can confiscate money in hand. Can you confiscate the body's glory? To this shameless girl, where is the need for cover and jewels? So, Akka Mahadevi declared that she was a shameless girl and she neither needed to cover her body nor she wanted jewels to decorate her body, because she had risen above the worldly status. O Lord, white as jasmine, when do I join you? Stripped of body's shame and my heart's modesty. So, giving up modesty was a very kind of a rebellious mood that most of these female bhaktas displayed, as was mentioned by Janabai. Cast off all shame and sell yourself in the marketplace. Then alone can you hope to reach the Lord. Cymbals in hand, a veena upon my shoulder, I go about. Who dares to stop me? The pallav of my sari falls away. Now, this is a very important line. The pallav of my sari, which is supposed to be the modesty of a woman, falls away. So, who cares where it is going? Yet will I enter the crowded marketplace without a thought. Jani says, my Lord, I have become a slut to reach your home. So, that was the kind of devotion of these female bhaktas, that they didn't mind even being called a prostitute, because their ultimate desire was their union with their God. So, they were definitely negotiating patriarchy in their own terms. The female bhaktas created an alternate space for themselves, which has left an imprint on folk memory as well. The mainstream history must incorporate this kind of oral tradition in history writing. Now, having discussed these various female bhaktas, the genesis of bhakti movement, as well as the social roots of bhakti movement, what emerges is that their poetry struck not only the mystic chords but also initiated the practice of voicing as women, adding another substantial dimension to the literary and the social world. So, it was not as if only the men who were very important literary figures or who contributed a lot to medieval Indian literature. So, if we take into account the writings, the compositions of these female bhaktas, definitely the field becomes much more broader. And as has been pointed out by Vijaya Ramaswamy, it is interesting that how not only the conformist bhaktas but also the rebels found a place ultimately in Hindu pantheon. The idea of a female ascetic was an absolute anomaly. Women were fundamentally meant to raise families, and the very idea of a woman renouncing this was a contradiction. So, women becoming ascetics was neither viable nor desirable, and definitely the family hardly supported this kind of a decision. But still, as I have shared with you, there were so many female bhaktas who did exactly the same. The bhakti movement turned many of these rigid hierarchical social orders on its head and pushed boundaries not just to those marginalized by caste and money, but more importantly to women, for whom it opened doors to religious freedom and self-expression. The groundwork for an egalitarian attitude towards worship was definitely laid during this period, and this is a very important observation about the Bhakti movement. Instead of the distant, esoteric and attributeless kind of worship, that is Nirgun, God that was mentioned in the scriptures, in the Upanishads, during this period there emerged an easy to please, approachable God to whom these women turned to as their friend, as their sakha, as their close confidant, as their companion, guide, and more often than not, even as their idealized lover or husband. So therefore, the ties of family were not completely given up, but definitely they were now replaced. So instead of the earthly family, instead of the worldly relations, now these female bhaktas were happier with the divine family and with the divine husband, because because no demands were being made on their physical and spiritual self by that distant God or that distant husband. So what emerges in due course of time was the feeling of empowerment. While the Bhakti movement may not have altered the material condition of life for women in medieval society, the female bhaktas undoubtedly provided women with greater emotional and psychological empowerment. And this was a very important contribution again of how these female bhaktas participated in the movement. It was a very subtle strategy of spiritual subversion, how it could serve women as an effective mechanism for letting off emotional or psychological steam, as well as for alleviating the frustrations of everyday life, the frustrations of domesticity, the compulsions of the routine household work that they were expected to perform. Women could at least envision themselves spiritually linked to the ideal male deity, even while forced to cohabit with their husbands and other paternal figures in the family. Thus, in determining the impact of a woman saint poet like Meera or Mahadevi Akka, it is critical to consider her role as a powerful psychological subversive. Bhakti saint poets were not social emancipators, but they were individuals who were struggling to liberate themselves, as has been pointed out by Neera Desai. So we cannot conclude by saying that these female saints wanted to bring about a complete change or a role reversal in society. There were individual situations and they were reacting to those individual situations on their own terms. So what now another very interesting observation that one can make is how these female bhaktas, they began as rebels, but how the dominant discourse ultimately kind of changed the direction of the interpretation, and there was a shift from rebel to the dutiful. Over a period of time, the lives and works of many women saint poets were domesticated and accommodated within patriarchal traditions, and they were well accommodated within the Hindu pantheon. In the popular imagination, Mirabai was gradually transformed from an outright rebel into a dutiful and chaste wife who was serving her divine husband Krishna with complete devotion and surrender. So this was the kind of reinterpretation that was taking place, which kind of tried to accommodate this rebellious mood of these female bhaktas into a new kind of interpretation that would be more conducive, that would be more acceptable probably to the wider audience. And as a result, the lives and works of several of these female female saint poets came to be described in a different manner. They came to be, there was now more of a hidden agenda probably that was operating, and that hidden agenda needs to be understood, that needs to be explored and questioned, and we need to take into consideration the fact that we must acknowledge that these women definitely had been rebels at some point of time. Thanks a lot.